Hi, I'm Laura Nelkin. I'm a knitwear designer. I live in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes region, and this is a tutorial for my latest design, Bandola. Bandola is January 2024's Lola's Choice design and kit. To follow along with this video, you will need the pattern. You can purchase that through the link below, or if you're signed up for Lola's Choice, you will have a download code in your kit. If you don't want to miss out on future kits like this, I'd love if you want to sign up for Lola's Choice. We have a blast knitting together every year. Links to that are below as well. Let's start this tutorial off with a little joke. If Lola and a bandana had a baby, what would it be called? Bandola. That is a very hard joke to tell. I've been working on it for a long, long time. Let me tell you more about Bandola. Bandola can be knit two ways. The version that I'm wearing has a knitted on beaded lace border, and that's for people who like a little bit of a challenging knit. And Goldie behind me is wearing an easier, kind of simpler version of Bandola called Simpola. So you've got two different choices on how you want to knit Bandola. Bandola is a classic neck scarf that starts with a garter stitch square. That square is knit tip to tip with yarn overs at the edges. Once you're done knitting your square, you will pick up stitches in those yarn overs all the way around the square and start your border. If you're knitting the version of Bandola that I'm wearing, you'll be working on a knitted on edging. And if you're working the simple version, you'll have a stockinette stitch edging that is integrated off of those picked up stitches. Bandola that I'm wearing has the lace weight yarn as the center square and sport weight yarn as the border. And Simpola is opposite with sport weight yarn at the center square and lace weight yarn for the integrated border. I love wearing Bandola. I've been kind of really leaning into this lace and flannel thing this winter, and I'm loving the juxtaposition of this warm and cozy little bandana scarf around my neck. I'm really excited to see how you all style your bandolas. One thing is that both of these versions of Bandola are 22 inches square. So before I dive into the knitting techniques that I get to teach you with Bandola, I think the first thing that we should do is look at materials together so that you are set up to have success knitting Bandola. Your Lola's Choice kit includes two gorgeous 100% wool yarns that are inspired by past and future travels of mine. The lace weight yarn that you got is Jamieson's Ultra. It is 50% lamb's wool and 50% Shetland wool. It is spun on Shetland, and the color that I chose is just like this absolutely gorgeous opal that has lots of kind of interesting color changes in it. It's really icy and reminds me of winter. The second yarn you got is a sport weight yarn from Wool Dreamers called Cautiva. This is 100% wool from Spain. It is spun in the La Mancha region of Spain, and it is absolutely gorgeous. And I love the way these two colors play beautifully together. Also in your Lola's Choice kit that you will also need if you are knitting Bandola are US size 6 beads. Those beads are used on the border. You will also need a dental floss threader or another tool. It's going to be hard to show this to you, but I'm grabbing it. A dental floss threader or another tool for stringing those beads onto your yarn. You'll also need some stitch markers. If you were in Lola's Choice, you got a pretty fun sparkly thong shaped stitch marker that I can't believe it's taken me this long to get you all a thong shaped stitch marker. And finally, you're going to need two 32-inch knitting needles. You'll want to make sure you get gauge, and we'll talk about that in the next section. But I used a US size 5 and US size 7 32-inch long circular knitting needles. You'll also need a small piece of stitch saver or a spare circular needle cord, whichever you have on hand will work. And that is for the provisional cast on when you get to working the border on Bandola. So those are the materials that you need. And once you've gathered those, then it is time to jump in and do a little gauge swatch. So let's go ahead and do that next. Okay, time to talk about gauge, which I know some of you do not love talking about, but it's very important to discuss it briefly. So you will notice on the first page of the pattern that I give you gauge blocked and unblocked for both the LY, which is the lace yarn, and the SY, which is the sport weight yarn. If you are working the version of Bandola that I am wearing, you're going to want to get gauge with the lace weight yarn. You will notice that that gauge is gotten on needle A, which is the smaller needle size. If you're working the Simpola version of the pattern, then that garter stitch square starts with the sport weight yarn. So you're going to want to get gauge for the SY, and that is done on needle B. If you are working with your yarn in your Lola's Choice kit, then you don't need to block your swatch. You can work your garter stitch gauge swatch. I would cast on for like, oh, I forgot I have such a good trick for this. To get gauge for this pattern, you can actually cast on for the garter stitch square and knit 3 or 4 inches in garter stitch as written in the pattern, and then stop and measure that unblocked if you are working with the yarn in the pattern. If you're working with another yarn and you don't have more yardage than is called for in the pattern, then I highly suggest stopping and blocking that swatch hard, just like you're going to do for your final shawl. And that is why I give you the gauge blocked as well as unblocked. But if you are working with the yarns in the kit or similar yarns that you found in your stash, then you don't need to do that blocking step. And what's really fun about getting to cast on just the very beginning, this is clearly not 4 inches like you should be doing, it's a little bit less than that. What's really fun about that is if you've gotten gauge unblocked, you can just keep knitting and you don't need to rip out. If you didn't get gauge, I really urge that you rip out and start again. If you have too many stitches per inch, that means that your stitching is too dense and you're going to want to go up a needle size to loosen up your stitches so that you get fewer stitches per inch. If you have not enough stitches per inch, then you're going to want to go down a needle size, making your stitches tighter so that you get gauge. If you have any questions about this, you can ask in the Ravelry group in the knit along thread that I'll have set up, or you can ask below in this video tutorial, and I am happy to help you understand a bit more about your gauge. So once you've gotten gauge, then it's time to cast on. You might have already watched the next section I'm going to show you as you're working that gauge, because as I just explained, they're a little bit interlinked. So let's get going with how to do the cast on and how to work that center square. Okay, I am working this center square for Bandola. I am starting with the LY and needle A. The first thing that you're going to do is take your LY and make a slip knot. You then want to take that slip knot and put it on a needle and put that needle into your left hand, which might be a little bit what you're not used to doing when you start with your slip knot. Then what you're going to do is take the other needle in your right hand, make a yarn over your needle, and then knit into that stitch on the left hand needle. And now you have 2 stitches on your needles and you have started the tip of your shawl. Now, as we are working the increase rows, The first stitch of every row is a yarn over, and it is worked exactly as we just did. The needle is going to come underneath your working yarn, and then you are going to knit across. So you continue on like that. This becomes really nice TV knitting once you kind of get going and get started and have a few stitches on your needle. Now I'm going to turn and continue like that. You are going to continue working the increase at the beginning of every row until you have 47 stitches on your needles. And then it is time to work this little Old Shale accent at the one edge of the, I'm losing my words here, at one edge of the square. So that's not mirrored on both sides. It's just on one side of the square. And I have a square that's a little bit farther along to show you what that setup is like when it is time to start to add in the SY for that Old Shale section. And let me just kind of get my yarn so that we are ready to go. I just want to show you this because I want to explain why we're doing it. When we start the first row of that lace section, the first thing that you're going to do is make a yarn over with the LY, and then you're going to grab your SY and go ahead and knit across. And the reason that you're doing the yarn over with your LY is when you go to pick up the stitches along the edge of the square in the yarn overs, it makes the pickup much more clean if the pickups on that edge are always in the LY and not in the SY. Now we're on the other side and we're going to yarn over with the SY and we're going to knit across. And I want to show you what that looks like so you don't lose the yarn over on the other side right here. Okay, and I am coming to that yarn over with the LY and I'm just going to work into it, and that ensures that you have not lost it as you work across. Now you will continue on with that Old Shale section. I believe you end up working 4 rows with the LY, and you'll just carry up your SY behind it so that it is carried along, and then you'll use the SY again in row 8 that you use it again. So it's the LY is used in 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, it was 4 rows. And then you'll continue with the SY for the lace stitches. And it makes this really beautiful, just kind of like elegant, wavy lace piece at the front of your bandola. So another thing that I would love to show you on bandola is once you've worked the increase rows, it's time to work the decrease rows. And you're going to work the decrease rows, but you're going to maintain the yarn over at the edge. And I've just got the SY attached right now because it's easy to show you this with. And what you're going to do is work a yarn over and then a SK2P. And what that looks like is you'll make your yarn over and then you'll slip one and then you'll knit 2 together. And then you'll pass that slip stitch over. And what that does is increase 1 stitch and decrease 2 stitches. And that ensures that you maintain those yarn overs at the edge, but you're decreasing 1 stitch every row. And that brings your square back down to the tip at the other edge. So that's everything that you need to know for working the garter stitch square. And once you've worked that, it is time to get ready to set up for the border. And let's do that together. Okay, Once your garter stitch square is done, it is time to work the setup and rounds for the border before you begin the knitted on lace border. So the first thing that you'll need to do is pick up a stitch in each yarn over all the way around. When you work this setup, you will not be picking up and knitting. You're just going to pick up the yarn overs, and on the next round, you will be knitting them. This is super easy to do, and I also urge you to let this be a make it work moment. So if you something happened with your garter stitch square and you don't have the same number of yarn overs on every side of your square, don't worry too much about it. You can kind of have a moment in this to make things work. It is so easy to pick up those yarn overs. All you're going to do with your right hand needle is pick up a stitch from the back to the front and put it onto your needle. You can see that I'm just picking up that yarn over and putting it onto the needle, and those stitches are all set up and oriented perfectly to be able to work into them as you are going around your border. Now the pattern calls for picking up 44 stitches down the first side of your square. Once you pick up those 44 stitches, clearly I have less on my little teeny tiny square, you're going to place a stitch marker and then pick up 45 stitches down the next side, place a stitch marker at the corner, 45 down the next side, place a stitch marker at the corner, and then 44 down that final side right there. And then you're going to slip one of those 2 stitches that was left when you were done with your garter stitch square, and each one of those becomes the 45th stitch for each side. If your stitch count isn't quite that, in the next round you work with the LY when you're knitting into all of those stitches, that's where you could work like an extra increase or decrease, like a knit into the front and back of the stitch or a knit 2 together to get yourself so that you have 45 stitches for each side of the square. So that's my little trick right there for picking up those yarn overs and getting yourself all set up to work in the round. Then you'll start to work a few garter stitch stripes in the round. And when it is time for you to integrate the SY, if you want to work with beads on the knitted on lace border, that is where you will string beads onto your SY before you start to work it for those garter stitch stripes. And that is written into the pattern with the bead count that you need to string on. You can use the dental floss threader for that. If you haven't strung on beads before, I do have a separate video that I'll link below that teaches you how to do that. Now, don't forget to read the pattern, and when you switch to working with the SY, you'll be switching from needle A, which you used for the body of the, for the square at the center of Bandola, to needle B, which you're using for the rest of the border, and you're going to put needle A aside and not use it again. So what I have on my needles right here is like a little teeny tiny mini square with this border already worked. And we're going to do the setup for the provisional stitches. And then I'm going to show you how to work that knitted on lace border, which is so fun to knit. I think you're going to have an absolute blast with it. All right, so I've got this square right here, and I've got to the last stitch in the round with the SY. And when I get to that final round at the very end, the pattern says to remove the end of the round marker, knit 1, and then slip that stitch that I just knit back to the left-hand needle. And then the pattern has you turn your work and provisionally cast on 10 stitches with attached yarn onto your stitch saver or onto a spare cable needle. I'm going to use my stitch saver, which is 2 millimeter hollow silicone tubing. If you have never worked with stitch saver before, I do have a blog post that tells you all about it. I will also link to that below. So to provisionally cast on stitches, I'm going to show you this. I do also have a video that goes into it in depth, and I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but that link will be below as well. Okay, you're holding your stitch saver below the needle in your right hand, and the first thing that you're going to do is make a yarn over onto your needle, and then you're going to dip down in front of the stitch saver and grab your working yarn. And now you have 2 stitches on your working needle and 2 stitches on the stitch saver. You're going to continue doing that until you have 10 stitches on your working needle and 10 stitches on the stitch saver. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Don't forget, if that's new for you, I have a video that explains that in detail. Now you're going to turn your work, and you have the right side facing of your work. And in the next chapter of this video, I'm going to show you how to work this border. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how this border works. I want to look at the chart with you and explain to you how to read a lace chart. And then I want to show you how the border gets built around the corners of your square. And then we will knit some stitches together so you understand what those lace stitches and the border looks like on your needles. Underneath the camera here, I have a bit of the chart to show you. And in the simplest way I could describe, I would say that every square on a chart represents a stitch. So if I look at the chart and I have a blank square, if I go and look at the chart key, I see that a blank square is a knit stitch on right side and wrong side rows. So the first stitch right there is a knit stitch. That next stitch right there is a right leaning decrease, which on the key is a knit 2 together. And then I've got a knit stitch and a yarn over and a slip slip knit and a knit 3. And then this last stitch right here is what we really want to talk about. What that last stitch is doing is a slip 1 knitwise with yarn in back, knit 1, leaving stitch on left hand needle, pass slip stitch over. We're going to do that together. But what is happening with that L is that we are attaching our border to the edge of the square, but not binding off that stitch. You will see if we look at the chart again on row 3 that we have a J right there at the end of the row. And that J is a slip 1 knitwise, knit 1, pass slip stitch over, and we are binding off a stitch from the square. So every time that you come to a corner of the shawl, you need to have more repeats of the lace stitch going around that corner so that they can bind out beautifully and not kind of like pull the square in at the corners. So as you work this knitted on border around the shawl, when you get to the corners, you'll be working more rows into fewer stitches to have that bend around the corners. And I think as you see me do it on my needles, it will make sense to you. And if it doesn't, definitely ask questions. Other things that I want to show you on the chart that I think are really unique to this chart is on row 3, you will see that there is a B, and that is knit 1 with a bead. I will show you how to do that. Remember, we strung our beads onto our SY when we brought that in to the garter stitch stripes before we're coming into the knitted on edging. On row 4, at the very end of row 4, because row 4 is read from left to right, I'll go over that in a second, you will see that that blue box means knit 1 with bead to back. I will also show you how to do that. And then finally on row 5, you will see that there is a gray square. You're just going to skip over that. It isn't a stitch. It's like a placeholder for the next row because you have increased stitches in row 5. What this edging does is kind of undulate with more stitches and then decrease to less stitches. And that's why you get this lovely kind of like round scallop all the way around with that hole in it right there. Two other things I want to tell you about reading charts is odd number rows are right side rows, and those are read from right to left. And even number rows or wrong side rows are read and knit from left to right. So while your blank box is a knit stitch on right side and wrong side rows, when you get to this left leaning decrease on row 2, you're going to see that that is a slip slip knit on the right side and a knit 2 together on the wrong side. That is the only stitch in this chart that has different directions for the right side and wrong side, but I think it's worth pointing out. Now, if that was a lot of words for you and you're confused, I also give you the written instructions for the chart. So if you prefer to work from written instructions, by all means, please go ahead and do this for this chart. You might work them for a few repeats and get comfortable working the stitch and then see if you can transfer yourself over to the chart. Personally, I love working from charts. I think it is much easier to work from a chart because every square in that chart represents a stitch and it's easy for me to read my knitting. But if they make your eyes swim, sometimes what you can do is use post-it notes to kind of, let's see if I can show you this, kind of block off so you are only working one row at a time and then that's all that you see on your chart. Some people, and I've seen a lot of people do this, just move up their post-it note by one row every row so that the rest of the chart that they haven't worked yet is blocked off. I think you'll slowly find the tricks that work for you as you get into learning how to read charts. I just lost my words for a second. Sorry about that. So now that we've talked about how to read the chart and how to work the border, I think we should work a few rows of the border together, and then I'll go over a little bit more what's happening as you work the border all the way around the square. Okay, I have my little mini bandola underneath the camera here, and we already have our provisional stitches on the needle ready to go to work the border. I'm just going to take a little end stopper, and you might want to do this as well, and kind of block off those stitches on the other end of your needle so that they don't fall off on you by mistake. And now I am ready to jump in with row 1. And I am going to put my needle into that first stitch and I'm going to knit 1. I am working from the chart right now. Then I am going to knit 2 together, knit 1, yarn over, slip, slip, knit, and then I am going to knit 3. And now I've got that funky L that we talked about. I'm going to slip 1 knitwise with yarn and back. I'm going to knit 1, but I'm going to leave that stitch on the needle. I'm not going to jump it off. And then I'm going to pass that slip stitch over. And now I am done with row 1. And I'm going to turn my work so that I am ready to work row 2. And the first thing I'm going to do is slip 1 purlwise with yarn in front. And then I'm going to bring my yarn to the back of my work. I'm going to knit 2, knit 2 together, yarn over, and then knit 4. All right, now I am ready to start row 3, and I had to go get a bead from down on my yarn. So you can see this bead right here. I'm gonna go in and knit that first stitch with a bead. So I'm sliding up a bead, I'm wrapping the working yarn around my needle and pulling that stitch through so that the bead is sitting up on the needle. That's your goal, that your bead is going to be sitting up on your needle like that. And now I'm going to knit 1, and I am going to knit 2 together, and I'm going to knit 1, yarn over, slip, slip, knit, knit 1, and now I am going to work a J stitch, which is a slip 1, knit 1, pass slip stitch over. And you can see what's happening here is that my knitted on border is starting to attach itself to the edge of the bandola. The reason that I'm working those alternating right side rows with the J and L right now on rows 1 through 8 is that I'm at the very corner. So I'm needing to work more rows into those sections so that it'll block out around the curve. And now I'm going to work row 4, and there's something fun to show you on row 4. I am going to slip 1 knitwise with yarn in front, and then I am going to knit to that last stitch that has a bead on it. And I'm just going to move those beads down. I don't need them quite right now. I am knitting to the end of this row. And when I get to that last stitch, I just want to bring that bead all the way to the back of the needle right there, and then knit into that stitch. And then that bead is just on my working yarn at the very edge of the border. And that's how you get that really beautiful like beads just sitting at the edge right there. So we've got that bead right there at the edge. We just finished row 4, and we are on row 5. The first stitch has a bead, so I'm going to slide up another bead, wrap that yarn around with the bead, pull that bead through so that it is sitting on the needle. Then I'm going to knit 1, and now this next maneuver might be new for a few of you. I'm going to make a triple yarn over. So I'm going to wrap the yarn 3 times around my right hand needle, and then I am going to knit 1, knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2, and now I'm going to work an L again, which is, I think of L as like leave and J as join. I am going to slip 1 knitwise with yarn and back. I'm going to knit 1 but leave that stitch on the needle, and then I'm going to pass that slip stitch over. And now I am going to turn my work. I'm just going to get that out of the way so it's easier for you to see. I'm going to slip that first stitch purlwise with yarn in front. I'm going to bring my yarn to the back of my needle, and I am going to knit 3, yarn over, get those beads out of the way there, knit another 3, and now I'm going to purl 1, and I have to do that because I've got 3 yarn overs in a row right there. I might have split that stitch. Let's just clean that up. Knit there, knit 1, and now when I come to the last stitch on row 6, I'm going to have the bead to back and knit 1. And now I'm going to turn my work, and I'm going to work rows 7 and 8. And there's nothing new to show you in those, so I'm just going to knit those quickly. And then I want to show you row 9 because that's pretty unique to this pattern and how we get that scalloped edge. All right, I am on row 9, and the first 3 stitches of row 9 are bound off knitwise, and then you continue across the row. One thing I'll say is rows 9 through 16 do not have any L joins where you're leaving the stitch on the needle. Once you get to the repeats of rows 9 through 16, you are binding off a stitch from the square every time you work a right side row because you're working down the straight edge of the shawl. So let's show you this bind off. It's super easy. I am going to knit one, knit the second stitch, and bind off one. And now I'm going to knit one and bind off two. And now I'm going to knit one and bind off three. And you will see that I have one stitch on my right hand needle. Now I am going to knit two together and then knit one and then yarn over and slip, slip, knit and continue across row 9. And what that bind off does, I just want to show you now that I'm a little bit farther. You can see that lovely little hole that we made when we did that triple yarn over. And then that bind off is kind of completing that scallop right there, that like really pretty little edge. So as you're working this, it might help you to kind of slow the section down, watch it once or twice, maybe try the border not joining it to any piece of knitting with some scrap yarn if this is a new technique for you and you really want to master it. Ask any questions that you have below. I think you're going to have a really fun time working this beaded lace border. The last thing that I need to show you about the border before I move on to a few things about Simpola is how to do the garter stitch graft once you work your border all the way around your shawl. And I have a little strip of the border that I'm going to show that to you with. Okay, let's go over how to do this garter stitch graft together. The first thing that you'll need to do is take those provisional stitches and get them back onto a needle. If you used a spare needle or a cord from an interchangeable needle set, you can just put a needle right onto that cord. If you use Stitch Saver, then you're going to want to take a spare needle, put that into the Stitch Saver, and then slide those stitches onto your needle so that you are ready to go. Then what you're going to do is hold those two needles parallel to each other with wrong sides facing and the needle with the provisional stitches towards the front. So your working yarn right here from that last row that you worked is on the back needle. Now, I love doing a garter stitch graft because it's actually the same move on both needles, so it's a little bit easier to remember. And I'm going to work it across so that you see what to do, because a few of you very astute people are going to notice that you have fewer stitches on your front needle than you have on your back needle. And that is because of that little bind off in the scallop that you didn't do when you worked the last repeat of the border. So I've already got my working yarn cut. I gave myself a quite long tail and I have it threaded onto a tapestry needle. And now I am going to go into the first stitch knitwise on the front needle and slip it off, and then the second stitch purlwise on the front needle and leave that stitch on. And now I'm going to do the exact same thing on the back needle. First stitch knitwise, second stitch purlwise. And I'm going to do the same thing on the front needle. First stitch knitwise off, second stitch purlwise on. First stitch knitwise off, second stitch purlwise on. You can see my tail getting caught up in there. Sorry about that. Now, as you work that, you just kind of want to pull up with even tension. And what that is doing is making a little garter ridge right there as those stitches are getting grafted. And now you're going to continue working that across until you run out of stitches on your front needle or the needle facing you. Okay, I'm just to the end right here, and that last stitch that is on my front needle, I am going to bind off knitwise. Sorry, just slip off knitwise. And now you can see that I have 4 stitches left on my right hand needle. And I think the best thing to do here is still slip that last stitch off knitwise and then bring your yarn through that stitch purlwise. And now grab a needle, which I need to grab and just ran away from me. And take that last stitch right there. I'm just going to kind of get my yarn out of the way so it's not bugging us. Slip it to my right hand needle. And now I'm going to knit the next stitch and bind it off. And then I'm going to knit that last stitch and make sure that you have your bead to the back right there when you go to knit that last stitch so that it lands in there perfectly. And then bind off that last stitch and pull your working yarn through. And then you have worked your stitches all the way around. I just made a tiny little adorable cuff, but that is how you will bind off your stitches from the beginning of your border to the end of your border so that you end up with an almost seamless spot where you grafted the beginning and the end of the border together, which I think is very, very slick. Definitely ask questions about that if you have any. It's pretty easy to do, and it just kind of builds itself together so beautifully in the end. We're going to talk about blocking in the finishing section of this. So if you are working the bandola that I'm wearing, you could jump ahead. But before we do that, I just want to quickly talk about Simpola and how it is different than the original version of bandola. Okay, if you are working the Simpola version of bandola, the biggest difference is the SY and the LY are switched. So you are working with the SY for the garter stitch square, and then the accents in the Old Shale pattern are in the LY. And then as you get into the border, you are really using the LY for the border right there. You are working everything on needle B, so you only need 1 needle size. We talked about that a bit in the gauge section. So the only other thing I kind of want to talk about Simpola is after you've worked the square, the pickup for the stitches is exactly the same as we went over in the bandola. So after you pick up in the yarn overs, then you want to look at your Simpola pattern because the border is worked a little bit differently, and you'll see from these lace lines that you have increases at the beginning and the end of every side of the square, and that increases the shaping for the square so that it continues being a square as you increase out around it instead of I think there's like an increase round in the bandola version to get you to the right number of stitches. So you'll be working increase yarn overs at the beginning and end of every square with a little stitch in between. That's all written into the pattern. And you're going to be working with the LY until you almost run out of the LY if you want to get the most out of it. And the way to do that is to work with a scale so that you have a little bit of SY left for working the bind off, and then you use as much of the LY as possible. If you haven't done that before, that's really easy to do. What you'll do is weigh your yarn and then work around and weigh your yarn again. And the difference between those two weights is the amount of yarn that was used in one round. I have a favorite digital scale that I use, and I'll give you a link to that below if you don't have a scale. I use them all the time in my knitting to get the most out of my precious skeins of yarn. So the other thing we could talk about Simpola is if you want to use beads in the bind off of your Simpola, that is really easy to do. And I have a video from years ago that shows you how to do a really simple beaded bind off. There's actually two ways to do that bind off. One way uses pre-strung beads and one way uses placed beads with like a crochet hook or a piece of super floss. And I'll give you links to both of those below so you can decide which you like. But what you'll need to do if you're working with a Lola's Choice kit is count how many beads you have in your baggie in your kit, and then count how many stitches you have per side and multiply that by 4. And then take that total stitch count number and divide it by how many beads you have. And then that is how many stitches you'll have to work plain versus how many stitches you can have with a bead on it. So to make this easy, if you have 400 stitches on your needles and you have 100 beads, that means you could work 3 stitches plain on the bind off and 1 stitch with a bead working the way around, and then you'll get the most out of the beads that you have. If you're working from a stash of beads and you have 400 stitches on your needle and you will say want to have a bead every other stitch on the bind off, then you would need 200 beads to do that. So it's pretty easy kind of stitch count wise and bead count wise to figure out how many beads you have. And that's a trick you might use in other places as well. So once you have finished your Simpola and finished your Bandola, it's time to just talk a little bit about blocking and weaving in ends, and then you are good to go. Okay, I'm going to admit that I told my dear husband and videographer that this was going to be a really quick, like 15-minute video, and I got really into teaching you a few things in here. There are a lot of fun little details to Bandola that I hope you enjoy learning and knitting. Once you are done knitting your Simpola and Bandola, I would weave in all your ends, but not trim them yet. I like to leave my ends until after I have blocked a piece. And then you're going to want to fill your sink with warm water and some wool wash, not hot and not cold, and soak your Bandola until it is really soaked up as much water as possible. And then you'll want to wring it out gently, roll it up in a towel or two to get extra moisture out of it, and then lay it down on your blocking boards. Now, Simpola and Bandola should be perfect squares. So as you are blocking and stretching your square out, this is where I would use a yardstick or a ruler to make sure that all of your edges are measuring a similar amount. As you kind of stretch out and block out a little farther, make sure you're doing that on the other side as well. If you have blocking pins, you'll want to go ahead and kind of block out all of these scallops. One thing that helped me is I kind of blocked out my center square perfect on Bandola, and then I carefully blocked out the lace edges all the way around. I believe I took a few really not great photos of Bandola blocking, and either we'll get these into the video or I'll get them up on Ravelry so that you can see an example of that edge all pinned out and blocking beautifully. So once you have your Bandola or Simpola blocked, then you'll unpin it when it's dry, trim those ends, and then put it on to wear it. I know a few of you are going to ask me how to wear Bandola, and I would say that at first when I was wearing it, I was folding it perfectly evenly, so the bottom corners were matching each other, but I actually found that I like it a bit more if you fold it a little bit uneven like that, so you're going beyond the corners a little bit, and then you take the ends and wrap it around your neck and tie it. And the trick to putting on shawls, I find, is to do it effortlessly and not put too much thought into micromanaging it, because your knits move as you walk and go about your day, and people are going to get to see all the different aspects of it. So again, Ask any questions before below. Anything I brought up, I will give you links to below. I'll make sure you have the knit along in the Ravelry group. I will give you links to join Lola's Choice if you want to, links to the pattern on Ravelry, links to, I think I already said the knit along. I really love knitting with you all, and I hope you have as much fun with Bandola as I had designing it. Happy knitting.